All right. Hello, everyone. And today we've got something pretty special, which is I get the opportunity to talk to a fellow booktuber who's been in the game a lot longer than I have and whose content I've enjoyed for quite a while, and that is King Crusoe, KC. So, how you doing, Casey?
Oh, I'm doing splendidly enough, we shall say.
There you go.
My
Uh,
first time being featured on somebody else's channel one-on-one in a recorded fashion, so that's
yeah. Well,
special for me too, I guess.
yeah. Happy to have you on. Like, I appreciate your channel for a number of reasons. One of them is, and this is something that you were saying before we went live, is that you're not like obviously like you're doing Wheel of Time now and you're famous for your Sun Eater stuff, but like you're not really pigeonholed to one genre or one thing. Um and so yeah, I guess tell me a little bit about your reading and what first made you want to start doing a booktube channel, and also about the scope of what you read and cover on your channel.
Okay, well, it's probably gonna be a long answer because I'm very bad at being brief about anything. Um, but so the short story is that I grew up, uh, not really reading. I was homeschooled until like partway through third grade and didn't even start learning to read until a couple months before going into school.
Hmm.
So I actually learned how to read and started getting into some of that stuff later than probably normal. But I did love to read throughout school until probably around high school happened. And then I had a number of years where I call it my multi-year reading slump for all intents and purposes, where I maybe read a few books a year, often like condensed into like a period during the summertime when going camping or something like that. Um, I graduated high school in 2020. What a great year that was to graduate, am I right? And then about a year and a half after that, it was mid 2021 where I started getting interested in reading a little bit more actively again,
Mhm.
and started getting into that. I found Mike's book reviews book chat or booktube channel, and joined his Discord there. That was where I found the bookish community to get involved with. And that made reading a little bit more exciting in some degree, and being involved with that community, and therefore implicitly also influenced by Mike's channel, was basically when I decided that I would do booktube, because
Mhm.
my YouTube channel has existed longer than it's been a booktube channel. It's been booktube since 2022, but I've been doing it in some capacity. I would say doing original content basically since late 2019, where I did a few drum covers. Then
Okay.
I did some music review stuff in 2020. That stuff is privated. The drum covers are still available. You can watch those, but the music review stuff isn't. And then I was doing video game stuff in late 2020 until I burnt out. And then it was like a year after that when I decided I wanted to revitalize things. And I decided that books would be the way I would do that. And I would take it slower so as to not burn out. And here I am, over 4 years later, and never stopped. So I guess it worked. But with regard to the other question, you asked about all variety of things that I read and
Yeah.
stuff like that. I guess the main point is that I've never been super pigeonholed as far as what I like to read in the first place. I have a mild variety from my reading history in that way, but also the main problem that I discovered when I was into reading was I get burnt out. I get like world fatigue, for
Mm.
example, pretty easily. If I read too much of the same thing in too small a span of time, I just kind of stop reading it, not because I don't enjoy it or because I don't want to, but because I just stop. So, a way to combat that when getting back into reading, this is part of how Mike's Discord worked so well, was a lot of like series read alongs, for example, were like one book a month. So if I read the one book a month, but had another book in between now and again that was something completely different, that was variety enough for me to not get fatigued
Sure.
out of any of these worlds. And that was very important. Like early in 2022, reading The Dark Tower back to back, but I was also reading a different classic book every month. That meant that I had a little bit of inherent variety in my reading. And when doing the booktube thing, I was like, well, I want to like actually review all of the books that I read in some capacity, just because that seemed fun and interesting to me. And
Mhm.
that's what I've continued doing. So the fact that I read variety is largely to avoid problems with fatigue or burnout or potential for that. And then the fact that I cover all of it was just a personal decision, and that means that I've not relegated myself to only fantasy or anything. Although I do predominantly cover fantasy, it's by no means the only thing that I do. And I'm very glad that I was doing that implicitly from the very beginning, or explicitly, I guess. But,
Yeah. So, I mean, you talked about like, when you started on getting into this, it was from Mike's Discord. So how much of like your recommendations came from that early time? Like, I guess where do you find what you want to? Because you read a lot of variety between epic fantasy, Stephen King, Ken Follett, Cormac McCarthy. Like, what do you decide what looks interesting to you, or is it sort of like a buffet? Why not a little of everything?
That's a good question. I would say definitely early on, a lot of that was influenced by Mike's channel and by his Discord server. The things that people were covering and enjoying for different reasons, and relating what I was enjoying with that in accordance, and trying to figure out just through those interactions what I might or might not actually enjoy on my own, for my own personal reasons. And as the years have gone on, it's become pretty easy to determine just inherently what is or isn't going to sound good to me as a rule. But I would say that definitely early on, a lot of that was just kind of interaction with the other book community, and mainly just wanting to get into fantasy properly, because I hadn't actually finished Lord of the Rings at that point. I had read like 1.5 of the books, or I guess I had technically finished the Two Towers, but the amount of time that it took me to read that book the first time was so long, I may as well not have really read the whole thing, to be honest. But so like joining the server, I joined to read along for that, to actually read it properly. I read The Dark Tower by Stephen King because I've always been interested in reading basically all of his bibliography. So that was just something that I wanted to do anyway. So I read that. And then some of the other fantasy stuff, like Wheel of Time especially, has been on my bucket list since basically as long as I can remember ever seeing those original covers on the mass markets in my school library at one point in time. So I knew that I wanted to focus primarily on fantasy, but knew that I especially had problems with world fatigue and fantasy. So I wanted to read other stuff as well. And that also included having YA stuff to read quicker. And of course, Mike's server had a monthly classic read along thing that was going on for a while. And that was how I read a different classic book basically every month for a hot minute, was through that. And honestly, if you are looking for variety in your reading and you're interested in reading classics, just throwing in a classic every month or two is the best way to give variety, because classics isn't a genre actually. So you can have anything and everything when you're just reading classics. So that was a big part of it, I guess. I don't know how well that answered the question, but
Yeah, because that was one other thing that grabbed my attention, was not just like, oh, this guy loves Sun Eater, I love Sun Eater, he's got a lot of interesting like reviews up on his channel, but also I don't know if it was like a favorite book list or a favorite classic list or whatever, but you very highly sung the praises of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, which is, I don't know if it'll ever be top, but like that's my favorite book. It's certainly
let's
not.
go. You're so based for that. It is basically tied for my favorite book. Let's go.
It's not a perfect book. Like cutting out 300 pages out of it would absolutely make it better. But I've never had a book.
It is also the easiest book to abridge ever.
Yeah.
So yeah, that book, that was also another one that kind of like Wheel of Time was on my bucket list for forever. The story about Les Mis, I'm sure I've mentioned this on my channel before, is my mom has a copy of that book that she's owned since way back when, the Everyman's Library edition, I think, that we've had. And I've known about its existence since 3rd or 4th grade. And I've kind of implicitly wanted to read it ever since then, just because it's a massive freaking book. And once I got through reading all of The Dark Tower in 2022, I was like, I think I'm probably going to be ready to read Les Mis. So while I was working on that, I had it planned to be the monthly classics book for November and December of 2022, because it's huge and giving it 2 months was appropriate, because it's twice as long as even the longer classics are in a lot of cases. So we did that. I managed to read it all. Like, I started it the first day of November, finished it the last day of November. It was the only thing that I read in November of 2022. And like, just as far as bucket list items go, it was like, I was so glad to not just have crossed it off the list, but to have resonated with it so well, even with the tangents. Like I said, it is the easiest book ever published to abridge, because everything that you can cut out of that book, Victor Hugo specifically puts into its own place.
That's right.
You know, he's just like, here's the background on this thing. And like, you can skip it. And in fact, you probably should. And if somebody were to take the unabridged version of the book and instead of abridging the story, they literally only just cut out the tangents.
Right.
I think you probably have, I think my copy is 1,300 pages. You could get an 800 or 900 page book out of that just by cutting out the tangents and not removing any story. And you might even manage to make it a little bit shorter than that. And that would be a better book. It would also be immensely easier to recommend. However, I didn't even hate the tangents. There were a couple sections that I struggled with in the moment, but that I appreciate in hindsight in a way. Things like Waterloo. I didn't like the Waterloo part when I first read it, but when it becomes relevant, it's like, okay, I get it now. Even though that took like 500 pages.
Like, there's a lot to know about Paris sewer system. Who knew?
That's the funny one that people always point out as being particularly egregious. I found that one of the more fascinating tangents in the book, and that one doesn't even happen until volume 5. Like, that one's very late as far as tangents go. The one that broke my mom, and the reason she never finished, was the convent one. And that's not until volume 3. That one might even be in volume 2. Like, that one's relatively early, so that one makes sense.
That one isn't terribly deep into the book.
And it's also not bad, actually. That one's actually more relevant to the main story than most of the tangents are. So I was surprised that one bothered my mom. But to be fair, that one bothered my mom because that one goes a little bit more into technical, like, theology stuff as far as the attitudes of nuns and Catholicism go. And that kind of thing has always disturbed my mom, relatively speaking. Sure. So I guess that makes sense from that capacity. But, you know, this is also...
Sorry, what?
No, you go. I don't want to ramble. I was going to bring up an entirely different book. So,
well, I was just going to say, have you ever read The Princess Bride?
I've not read it. No, I've heard it differs from the movie, but of course I've seen the movie.
So the book is and some people hate this. You know, they just hate it. But it's kind of this funny gimmick that Goldman does in the book, where the book is set up as an abridged version of this larger old classic called The Princess Bride, and so like it's not. But it's like
I had no idea that was the premise.
So it's written as, like, it's not exactly a framed narrative, but like Goldman writes it as though he's discovering, you know, he tracked down this classic that's little known, and then he went through and cut out all the old boring parts. So here's like a section where there would be 80 pages of describing all the princesses' dresses, and he's like, I cut that out. He has like a footnote saying, like, you know, that's not one of the... And so the version of The Princess Bride that you'll like buy at the store is called The Princess Bride, the good parts version, where he cut out all the bad parts and this is just the good parts. I'm like, you need to make like a good parts version for Les Misérables.
Yeah, it could honestly use it. You know, as much as I adore that book, it's difficult to recommend because there isn't an abridgment of the book that only cuts out the tangents for some reason.
If you had to pick like just three novels that you're like, I want to give somebody like a clear image, or at least a taste of like what my reading preferences are or what my reading taste is, and like here's like the Casey starter kit, what would be like 3 books that you'd pick out for that?
Good grief. Okay, let me open my video notes here and go to my Casey canon real quick and just look at my favorite books and see what I could possibly pick out of here. Man, 3 books. This is going to be rough, actually. Can I cheat to some degree and like have like pairs of books bunched together where it's relevant? One of them I'm going to say is the Iliad and the Odyssey together. Not just because of classical literature and poetry and epic, you know, true epics and the way that epics originally were imagined, but also because a huge part of my reading journey growing up was being into Rick Riordan, which of course is Greek mythology stuff, and the Iliad and the Odyssey being a big part of original Greek mythology, but also having a little bit of that classical flair. Love those books. If you want a good idea of some of my more classical knowledge, if I have any, I'm comparing myself to Christopher Rocchio here. I have none compared to him.
Sure.
But the Iliad and the Odyssey are fantastic. And specifically, I recommend the Peter Green translations. They're relatively recent translations, but they're great. I do not recommend Robert Fagles as a translator, infamously. Even though I haven't read his Homer, I've only read his Aeneid, but it was bad. But so Iliad and the Odyssey is going to be one of those picks. The next one, let's say Fellowship of the Ring, Lord of the Rings in general, for the fantasy side of things. I think that's a pretty solid pick there. I'm not even going to say necessarily that it's my favorite fantasy book, but it's up there. Not just because of grandfathering it in like some people like to accuse us booktubers of doing, but genuinely because it's great. I adored Fellowship of the Ring when I read it in 2021. At this point, that's been 4.5 years ago. Alternative to Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit is actually a pretty solid pick, because that also goes into the sort of younger fiction side of things, which I still really enjoy. So we'll say The Hobbit, because it kind of combines that. But the next one is going to be rough to pick. Let's say Frankenstein, as far as classics go. That was like the first classic that I read when I was getting back into reading in February 2022. That was the first monthly classic that was out there for Mike's server, and the one that I started off joining on. And that was the one that really started making me think about books in a review format differently. It was the first book that I technically wrote a scripted review for. So in a sense, that one's also personal from a, content to personal reviewing format side of things. So yeah. And if I'm going to give like an honorable mention to, something that isn't like the classic or the fantasy side of things, I can't not include Sun Eater as a general reference. That's too big in my life to ignore.
How'd you first hear of Sun Eater, and at what point did you know, like, this is like perfectly tuned to me?
That's a really interesting question. So I first heard about Sun Eater because of being in Mike's server, and the fact that Christopher was in Mike's server for a long time. And to be fair, Mike from Mike's Book Reviews is the reason the series is still alive at this point. Him covering Empire of Silence in 2020, I think, somewhere around the time that Demon in White was coming out, was the only thing that kind of like saved that from being one of the, casualties of the pandemic and everything that was going on with that, because that was when that was publishing. But so it was being in Mike's server and actually interacting with Christopher while I was reading Lord of the Rings that kind of made me aware. I didn't even know that he was like the author Christopher Rocchio when I was interacting with him at the time. It wasn't until like a couple months later that I realized that that's who it was. But so there was that going on, and somebody had organized a read-along for Sun Eater to start in August of 2022 with Empire of Silence. That was going to be the month after I finished reading The Dark Tower by Stephen King, which was my monthly read-along series prior to that. And the person who was going to be running that read-along decided to drop out, to not run it anymore, and I took over. So I was then running the read-along for it. So it was going to be my experience my first time alongside everybody else. And so I read Empire of Silence and Lesser Devil in August that year, and I enjoyed Empire of Silence a lot. Like, I ultimately rounded it up and gave it 5 stars initially on Goodreads because I was so impressed with it as a debut offering. But I did have some minor notes to go against it, like with regard to some of the pacing and stuff. I really enjoyed The Lesser Devil to a similar degree, despite being way short. But I would say it was the climax, if you know, of Howling Dark when I read that in September. Well, the Brethren sequence was also up there. There was a lot of things in Howling Dark where I was like, this is for me. But after the climax, after finishing that book, I was like, I think this series is going to be up there. But I would say it was definitely when I read Ashes of Man. Well, I mean, Kingdoms of Death did somewhat similar, but when I finished Ashes of Man and was like, man, this is like tied with Les Mis for my favorite book of all time, that was when it was like became really obvious to me that this was like my favorite series. So I knew after Ashes of Man that it was my favorite series. And then I've just been experiencing more stuff ever since then, basically. But I would say Howling Dark was when I had a very good idea, but it actually took me until after Ashes of Man before I was willing to admit and say for sure, go on record saying, this is for me.
And what is it about like Sun Eater that caught you in a way other series hasn't? Is it the scope of it? Is it just the character of Hadrian? Is it the world building? What's been it about it that's grabbed you?
It's hard to say, actually. I don't know if there is much of a straight answer for that, largely because, you know, there's a little bit of hindsight is 2020 kind of thing. But it's also the fact that it's very easy to ascribe things to your past self that weren't actually there because of hindsight. And so I kind of feel that way with Sun Eater. And because Sun Eater has, the way that it has existed in my life has changed so much over the last, what is it, 2026 now? The last, we'll say 3 years. It's really hard to look back at those early memories with the series in that relatively objective way and, you know, picture it the way that people would want me to in that sense. So it's really kind of difficult to answer that kind of question. I'm just so far removed from that relationship with the series that I initially had. What was it that made it that made me love it? I don't know. It just clicked. I mean, the way that Howling Dark took some ideas, particularly from a first person story narration that you don't expect and that an author sort of isn't allowed to do actually, but he did it anyway. If you know, you know, that was something that I really respected. But for whatever reason, just something about it just connected more. And I would say when I started first rereading those first couple books the first time, realizing that you can go from completely identifying, that's the word. I was trying to think of objectifying, and that's not the word. Identifying with younger Hadrian the first time that I read the series, but on a reread, completely identifying with narrator Hadrian, and having two totally different experiences is something that in the years since then has made me love it even more, because it's two entirely different series to me now because of that, you know? So it's just a lot, and the years have changed that for me.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about the series so much is the way that Rocchio handles Hadrian's character arc. So much so that people even criticize it. But well, when we get to that in a second, you start out with like Hadrian in Empire of Silence being relatively naive about how the world works, you know, and you don't realize just how naive until
he's our naive little baby Hadrian in those first couple books, man.
Yeah.
He did not know jack diddly shit.
It's like,
and
what?
Neither did any of us.
Right, but like on the second read, well, and it's almost like the second read gives you the context of author Hadrian of being like, you dumb punk, what were you thinking?
Yeah, you notice more starkly the way that narrator Hadrian disagrees with his past self or calls out in explicit moments, just like, hey, this guy was a fucking idiot in this moment, by the way. But you don't like really recognize it the first time reading. Like, you'll notice, but it doesn't hit as hard.
Yeah.
Until you're rereading it, you're just like, he was warning us the entire time.
And I appreciate how he progresses and matures and comes to understand the world better, to the point that when you get to the end of Disquiet Gods and Into Shadows Upon Time, Hadrian's not going through an arc in the same way that he is in the earlier story. Like, he has matured, he has grown up, he's gotten to the position that he needs to be in to get to the ending of the story. And it's about doing the job. It's not about like coming to some moment of self-realization. And so I've seen people online complain about that with Shadows Upon Time, being like, but he doesn't change or progress as a character. And it's like, well,
he's already lived really like 700 years, dude. Like, yeah. he has fully had his arc, and the last couple books have really tested him. I mean, the couple books before that really tested him. That's what made him into the person he was for the last two books. So he's basically gone through I would say Hadrian has gone through 90% of his character arc by the time he leaves Jad.
Yeah, that's
But
about
you
right.
could argue that he's gone through that much of his arc before he even gets to Jad. But certainly by the time he leaves Jad, he's had 90 or 95% of his arc happen.
Well, it's
So
like all the way up to that point is just like setting up the dominoes, and then it's just like watching it fall for the last book and a
Yep.
half, book and 2/3 something. So,
Yeah, exactly. That's getting in there and actually finishing the job. That's the entire premise of the last 2 books.
What do you think people are missing who read the series and don't go read the short stories? Like myself, unfortunately, guilty. But
have you read the novellas?
I have read the novellas. But
okay,
for people
so it's
who
just
skip,
the short stories you haven't read.
Right. Yeah. So
okay.
For people who skip both of them, what do you think they miss out on?
Well, in the case of novellas, you are actually missing out on some degree of story context that I think is, I think it's decently impactful in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
The Lesser Devil is probably the least relevant as far as the 3 go in that way. But it does have a couple of things that pop up by Disquiet Gods that are going to be a little bit more meaningful to you if you have read The Lesser Devil. For example, Queen of Mid-Ashes is like an unnecessary middle chapter in the series that is still Hadrian. It's basically like the main series, but it's a little side excursion in there. And again, it's not super relevant. It just so far as like some references in the series, you'll understand a little bit better if you've read it. Mostly, I think that Queen of Mid-Ashes, especially if you read it chronologically, is cool because the writing and the philosophy of the narration is slightly more akin to like Ashes of Man era, because Christopher wrote that after Ashes of Man, actually, I think, somewhere in that time period. So there's a little bit of, the prose of it that changes in that way. Dregs of Empire, I think, is arguably the one that if there's going to be one novella that you have to read, that I would urge people to read that in between Ashes of Man and Disquiet Gods, just because of character reasons. For reasons that I'm not going to say because it would basically inherently be spoiling. So I'm not going to. But that one is just there are a lot of character reasons why that one I think is, again, impactful. They're not so much important as they are impactful. They'll add a little bit of substance to what's already in the series. The short stories are a little bit of a tougher sell because some of them are pretty irrelevant to the series at large. I actually did a video, I don't remember how recently, it wasn't that long ago, where I basically recommended the Sun Eater as far as like a reading order goes. I think it was at the very end of last year. And I had like 4 or 5 different recommended orders. And there's obviously just reading the series. There's reading the series with the novellas, reading with the novellas and the short story collections. But I also had a couple specific orders that included some of the short stories that are more relevant to the main story, like stories that feature Hadrian as a character, or otherwise feature other important characters or events that are referenced as like, primary side stories, secondary, and then like tertiary stories, where the tertiary ones are like ones that aren't relevant. Secondary are the ones that are, referenced but not important. And then the first category are the ones that are either directly relevant or will impact your experience with the main series in a notable way. It's hard to say that very many of them are necessary, but I would argue that all the ones that do feature Hadrian as a character, people should read just because they're Hadrian. There are a few particular ones, a trilogy of short stories, you could say, that occur in between Disquiet Gods, or Ashes of Man and Disquiet Gods, so books 5 and 6, that are basically like a little novella that occurs before Disquiet Gods and gives you more time on Jad, that I think are really worth reading because of that, and are a better introduction to a particular side character as well. But as a whole, I think that people who haven't read the short stories are mostly just missing extra universe context stuff, and mostly a handful of cool ideas that don't really pop up in the main series. Like there is some cool stuff in Disquiet Gods that is explored, and you do see that in the series because Hadrian, but there's like a particular dynamic to the way that a certain type of thing works on Sabratha, for example, that is going to make more sense and also be even more epic to you if you've read the short story Mother of Monsters from Volume 3. But in some cases, it's mostly actually the stories that are completely irrelevant to the main series that you might be surprised by. Like some of my favorites are Parliament of Owls and it's in Volume 3. Volume 3 is solid. Everyone should read Volume 3. But there's two particular stories that are like a very noir style of writing that has Christopher telling me I should watch Cowboy Bebop because of it. But there's like a detective noir thing going on with a couple stories, and some of those are my favorites, and they're otherwise completely unrelated to the main series, aside from like the Wong Hopper Consortium being referenced in Parliament of Owls, for example. But sometimes it's just being surprised by some of the special stuff that Christopher has in there. So it's like hard to recommend as a case of like, well, if I don't like short stories, should I read them? It's like, well, I think you should read the ones relevant to the main series, but I can't make that argument, if you're against short stories. But, it's a pretty wishy-washy answer, I know, but.
No, that makes sense. Since it's like relevant, let's talk about this, because you did a video on this a while ago, which really got my interest because I haven't seen many other people do dedicated videos to Adaman. Tell me what you think of Adaman, and also like what makes it special in your mind, and like where you think you could see this going farther on down the line, and why people should get on board with it.
Well, Adaman, if people don't know, is a separate series of, at this point, they're all short stories / novelettes. They're all in the like, I mean, they basically all average like 15,000 words, I think, for 3 of them. So they're not very long, but they're separate short stories that Christopher has written that are unrelated to the Sun Eater universe, that are kind of doing their own thing. They do feature a nomadic type of, basically mercenary type of figure, who also has a kind of legendary aspect to himself that is really neat. A lot of what I appreciate about Adaman is the world building, and also the kind of sword and sorcery thing that it's kind of doing. Because I actually haven't read things like Conan, for example. I haven't read much of anything sword and sorcery outside of Adaman, for example. So there's not much that I can really relate it to, except for being able to say that Christopher's writing style is inherently different because of exploring Adaman in a different way, and the fact that Adaman is a third-person narration compared to Hadrian, which is a pretty exciting thing. But as far as what I think makes Adaman special, I think a lot of it is just tone. When because I first read The Barrow King, which was the first one of those stories, like, I don't know how long. I want to say it was probably like a couple months before anybody else knew about Adaman at all. And he kind of sent it to me randomly, and I read this thing, and I was like, this is one of my favorite things I've ever read from you, period. And it is still, I think, my favorite Adaman short story out of the 5 of them. Are there 5 of them? I think it's 5 of them. But something about Adaman just kind of works in a way that Hadrian doesn't, just completely separate, despite them being somewhat familiar in some regards. And I don't know. I just really like I like Adaman a lot.
Yeah,
you can call me biased in that regard, but when I read The Barrow King, like I said, the first one of those stories, which everybody can read for free, mind you, for whatever reason, that one just immediately struck and was like, this is like maybe my favorite short story that he's ever written. It's just really solid. If you want some Adaman, here's the way that I'll put it as a recommendation. If you are somebody who isn't super interested in Sun Eater, or if you more or less bounced off of Sun Eater, I recommend people try Adaman, just because the stories are short. But like The Barrow King in particular is a really solid one-off story as an introduction to a different character in a different world without, committing to anything huge. That's part of what makes Adaman fun.
I read a bit of some of them, but I have a few left to go, and I've really enjoyed them. So I'm excited to see where they go as the world gets bigger, I suppose.
I think the 5th story, which is titled Nightus of Vaughn, I think is what it's called. That one's in the Grimoire collection from Dragonsteel Nexus 2025. So that story in particular introduces a new side character who I think Christopher is planning to make a relatively recurring character.
Okay.
I think going forward, like these first handful of stories are all pretty separate from one another, but I think, and I don't know how much of this I'm actually even allowed to say, but I think the idea is he wants to start building something a little bit more narrative with the individual pieces. So kind of like if you imagine a collection of short stories that actually tell a full novel story, maybe. I don't know. That part's completely speculation, but he does want to include some more recurring characters and stuff like that in Adaman, and I think that the Knight of Savon character is one of those characters that will probably feature in that way. So, Adaman's still going to grow, but the first handful of stories are separate enough that,
Sure.
you can just jump in.
Nidus is one of the ones that I haven't read yet, so I'm wondering if there's a way to get it without getting the grimoire, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I would assume that the grimoire would have. Actually, I have no idea if they do digital copies of those convention exclusive books.
I should look that up. Yeah.
I know they have like other types of collections like Unfettered and stuff like that on in other places, but I don't know about grimoire specifically. So that would definitely be something to look up. Well, I'm sure Christopher will obviously be able to publish it himself at some point after like a year or whatever the contract is for exclusivity reasons, but
yeah. Well, I'll ask because with Sun Eater, like, is space opera something that's like of general interest to you? Do you have other like series that are space opera that you've read or that you're looking forward to read, or is this kind of a special case for you?
Up to this point, Sun Eater is surprisingly a little bit of a special case. I did a collab a few years ago on my channel with Words in Time, who is a science fiction specific channel, where I asked him to recommend me space operas for a Sun Eater fan in the first video, and the other one was just science fiction recommendations and stuff in general. Basically, with that, idea of me being a Sun Eater fan, but not being super versed in sci-fi as a rule. So I haven't actually read a whole lot of other stuff, and it's been years since those videos, and I still haven't gotten any of that stuff, unfortunately. But I think that, man, what's it called? The Expanse is probably the next space opera that I want to get into, and I do want to start reading Star Wars stuff here eventually.
Oh, sure.
But beyond that stuff, and then my general familiarity with Star Wars as a film property, I can't say there's a whole lot of space opera that I know, let alone have read, to be honest with you. I haven't science fiction. I've definitely covered a lot less than some other stuff on my channel, and science fiction is such a broad genre that it's like, and space opera is just as much fantasy as it is sci-fi.
Well, everybody like get ready to take a shot. This had to come up somewhere. Like, I gotta ask, like, is Gene Wolfe on your radar? Is
yes, absolutely, he is on my radar, but I've not taken the plunge for a couple of reasons. One of those is because of time and dedication reasons. Another one of those is because I would like to get solid matching editions of Book of the New Suns or the Solar Sequence in general, but there's not really matching editions of the full thing, unfortunately. But the main thing is that I just haven't had occasion to at this point yet. But definitely a huge blind spot considering I'm a huge Rockio fan, and my association with him now. The fact that I haven't read any of his stuff is a little strange, maybe, but he's on the radar for sure. I would like to.
Yeah, Wolfe isn't somebody that I recommend to like everyone, but especially with your appreciation of like more literary stuff in addition to fun, pulpy sci-fi stuff, people who like experiment around with literary styles. It's like, okay, well, like that's a lot of like what Wolfe is doing in Book of the New Sun and the Solar Cycle in general. So I think there's a lot of things there that you'll enjoy if you get to it.
Yeah, I think so too, and that's also not least because there are a lot of Wolfe references, both implicit and explicit, in Sun Eater, including the sign off type of thing, which is basically ripped straight from Wolfe, even though funnily enough the first draft of Empire of Silence was written before he had actually read Wolfe, and even the first draft of Empire of Silence, The Murdered Son, which is there. You can sort of see it. Even that has a very similar type of sign off. So
Oh,
just
you're
authors
kidding.
having, even The Murdered Son has a similar
That's
style of sign off.
hilarious.
He did definitely change it so that it's more explicitly
Right.
referencing Book of the New Sun afterwards, but he hadn't read it before he initially wrote that draft, I think. So part of that was accidental to a degree. As far as I understand, anyway. I might be lying about some of that, but don't take my word as gospel. I am not Christopher
Sure.
Rocchio, but yeah, Wolf is someone I'm excited for, especially for what you said, like the literary side of things, because I do like some literary stuff every now and again.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things, Casey, that first like really got you on my radar as far as a booktuber is, you talk about Sun Eater, and I'm really thankful that that's become very popular in recent time. And you talk about Stephen King, who's as popular as I don't know,
Just about
sliced
any
bread.
genre fiction author in
Yeah,
existence, probably the most popular genre fiction author.
right. But like, then there will also be these like out of nowhere things that I see pop up like that you're reading. The first one that really grabbed my attention is that you've read Another Kingdom, the Another Kingdom trilogy.
Yes.
And then you've read like the Vickery and Castine books by Tim Powers and like Witchy Eye. And just recently, what is this? Penance of Blood was a book that you read. So
yeah, that one you can't actually see it in the frame on StreamYard, but it's actually right on my shelf back there.
yeah, so where do these like out of pocket, like super underrated books that pique your interest, where do they come from?
Well, some of these come into my radar in rather unexciting ways. We'll say it's things like Tim Powers, for example. So the Vickery and Castine trilogy, Tim Powers on my radar because of Rocchio. Dave Butler has been on my radar primarily because of Rocchio, but also on my radar in general. Initially, anyway, it was just Rocchio kind of encouraged that to happen a little bit earlier. Vickery and Castine, I will say, was not the most fantastic place to start off with Tim Powers. It's got some really cool and interesting stuff going on, but it's also like modern enough at the same time as doing some things that feel like it should belong in a setting that's like 20 or 30 years before it is, that feel weird, but besides the point. Some of these more kind of off the wall picks just come from where I'm generally interested in. I had the ability to listen to the audiobooks of the Another Kingdom trilogy by Andrew Clavin, and decided to just do that as like my first foray into audiobook related stuff, and ended up enjoying it. I will say Michael Knowles' narration of that trilogy is actually really good. People who know Andrew Clavin and Michael Knowles for political reasons would probably have no idea that that is the case, but really cool stuff. And Another Kingdom has some really, really great portal fantasy ideas going on, particularly with regard to like switching back and forth constantly between the two worlds, rather than the Narnia approach of just being in the fantasy world the whole time. That's really fun. So like that one was on my radar just because I had access to the audio. Some of the other picks are just because of Rocchio. The Penance of Blood was actually more because one of the members of the Red Company, the Sun Eater fan Discord, is in there, and we've kind of had known about his web novel Oathbreaker for years at this point. And it was, a couple years ago when people who had been reading the web fiction were like, when are you going to get this, submit this to an actual publisher? And he was like, haha, funny. But then an actual publisher asked him for it.
Wow.
So it's actually a web novel from Royal Road that is being republished, like re-edited and then published officially. And we did that book as a read along in the Red Company to celebrate the book coming out in February. So that's where that one came from in particular. Sometimes the things that just end up in my radar randomly are just because of friends, because I have a close group of friends that I have like a private, it's not my server, but I'm in a private server with like 24 other people, friends that I've had since the early days of being in Mike's server, for example, that, and quite frankly, a lot of them read a lot of random shit that nobody on BookTube has ever heard of before. So that's how I come up with some of the things I read, is because of that. And that's also part of how I get my variety nowadays, is by some recommendations from that.
Okay, yeah, because like Another Kingdom, I'll say, like I like the trilogy, but that first book, like I don't expect this to be true of literally anyone else. And I talk about it, but I stopped recommending it because I realized like, oh, this is like personally resonant for me. But like for me, that first book, Another Kingdom, is one of my 5 favorite books I've ever read.
Interesting.
Like that one means a lot to me, and I can't really explain why. And I've had a lot of other, like even other booktubers that have read it, and they're like, oh yeah, good, really liked it. But you know, it's sort of like an out of body thing for me, but probably not for necessarily everyone else. But I'm excited that you read it, and it seems like you enjoyed it too. So
Yeah, the first book was solid. I think I rated it 4 stars, so I still really liked it. The second book I was a little bit less into. I would like to reread the trilogy because I was like kind of out of it when I was going through The Nightmare Feast. That's the second one. So I only remember like one scene from that entire book, so I just kind of found it relatively unmemorable. But the third book, I really loved the third book. That's in my favorites shelf on Goodreads. The third book has a sequence similar to something that happens in Howling Dark that was also like transcendental when I was listening to that at the time. And I'm pretty sure I actually read that at a relatively similar time as when I was just about to get into Sun Eater. I think it was summer of 2022. I just want to double check real quick out of my own curiosity. No, I didn't want to check my red shelf. I wanted to check my favorite shelf because it's on there. Yeah, so if things would load, where in the world is Another Kingdom in my ranking here? So the Emperor's Sword is, I read that in July of 2022. So that would have been the month before I started Sun Eater. So I wonder how I'd feel about that now.
That's really
if I reread it now.
Yeah.
Not to spoil anything that happens in the third book, but there is a really cool sequence in there that is somewhat similar.
Well, and I'll say, I people who watch my channel would know this. I'm like massive Tim Powers fan, so I'm really glad that you've at least tried his stuff. Yeah, I only read alternate routes of that trilogy. I need to read the other 2, but it's not that those aren't good. That alternate routes wasn't good, but it's not the best sample for what Tim Powers' shtick normally is.
Yeah, I could tell that as soon as I finished the first book. I was like, this doesn't seem like the thing that Tim Powers normally does, and a lot of that's because it's a pretty modern book, a modern setting book. The second book is it's very overly long, I think. But the third book I think is my favorite of that trilogy as well, mostly because it deals with a particular subject matter in an actually interesting way that other people who try to deal with that subject matter usually don't. So I respected that. But yeah, Tim Powers' shtick is normally something very different, like with Stress of Her Regard and Hide Me Among the Graves, even Declare, obviously on Stranger Tides, Anubis Gate.
So alternate routes is like one of his more modern, like I would call it like a paranormal urban fantasy novel, and I think that would be others.
That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, and he has a few others that are like paranormal urban fantasy. Like I haven't read it yet, but my understanding is like Last Call is sort of that type of thing as well.
And that is also another trilogy.
Yeah, and the one that I'm reading right now, 3 Days to Never, is also on that vein. But with Last Call and like 3 Days to Never, he's still doing sort of that secret history thing. There's like 3 Days to Never has like Albert Einstein not only helped create the nuclear bomb, but also helped create this like time machine that can zap people out of existence so that they were never even, like born in the first place. And so there's this like race in the 80s to try to like discover who has this time machine. And so it's kind of doing something a little different than even like alternate routes is, which is pretty straightforward, just like paranormal investigation type stuff. So
yeah, it's also, like I kind of said before, it's also definitely set in the modern world. It's set in mid 2010s America, which is not a Tim Powers setting as far as the stereotype goes. So it's not that I didn't like those books, and I definitely do plan to read more Tim Powers. I own almost all of the audiobooks. There are notably like 2 books of his that still don't have audiobooks.
3 Days to Never is one of them.
Yeah. So I own basically all the audiobooks, and I want to read more of his stuff, but man, there's like no time. And I did not read very much in 2025 either, so I feel like I'm sort of implicitly behind because there's a solid like 24 books that I just didn't have time to read in 2025. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, not to be like, oh, when are you gonna get to? But like, are you interested in continuing the Witchy War books by Butler?
I've been wanting to do that. Yes, I was thinking I was going to try to fit one of those books in this year, and it did not end up on my TBR. So, I'm not sure if it's going to be this year. There might be some news about that series at some point soon-ish, because I think Butler is actually either working on currently or is very soon to be working on the last two books. So that's exciting, and it makes me want to pick it back up. But that one's definitely a series that's like, I need to get back to that. It was like Faithful and the Fallen when I read Malice, and then it was 14 months until I read Valor. Now it's been 17 months since I've read Witchy Eye, so
Okay.
I need to continue that series, but I don't know when.
Yeah,
I would very much like to, though.
Yeah, I just read Dave's Cunning Man books last year and loved them, and then jumped into Witchy War this year. I'm in Witchy Winter right now, so that's book 2. So that's why I ask.
Yeah, soon trademark.
That's right. How do you figure out, like, a couple questions about your reading here specifically? How far in advance do you plan what you read, and how do you decide like what you want to read next? Is it just like based on whims, or do you have a method to it?
I have a couple different things, and this has actually changed over the years. I want to say it was in like the first quarter or so of 2023. I actually made a video that was like how I decide my TBR, or how I prioritize my TBR, basically. And the idea back then was, when I was still really active in Mike's server. I'm not in Mike's server anymore, but just because of time. I don't have time for anything. You see how I post a video between my two channels every day for like 2 months now? Yeah, anyway. So, not to self-plug or anything, just saying I spend a lot of time doing other things now, so I'm not Discord very much anymore. But back then, my idea was I usually had like a series that I would be participating in a read along for. So it was like a book a month there. And then at the time, I also had the monthly classics that I would almost without fail, or try to without fail, participate every month or 2 months, depending on if a book took 2 months, if it was longer. So those were like the two main things that I used to build my reading schedule around every month. Was like, I had the classic, whatever that was going to be, and I had my read along book, whatever that was going to be. And usually that meant I had time to fit in 1 or maybe 2 personal picks, whatever those were, depending on how long they were or what they were. And in a lot of cases, that would be like a Rick Riordan book, something short, or YA. Sometimes I just throw in something else random. It wasn't really consistent what I did. That later pick was sometimes a little bit more for my own, just whims, basically.
Sure.
So my mood reading proclivity, I guess, what little mood reading proclivity I have at this point, was satisfied by doing that. Nowadays, I mean, I guess you could still say something somewhat similar happens. For example, the last 3 years at this point, I've had like some things planned out, but some other things a little bit looser. When I'm reading my next Wheel of Time book has been pretty solidly set in stone for the most part, a few books ahead of time. And I'll have a couple books that I'll plan to read alongside that, just because of their length and the way that I read those. But nowadays, I think I definitely run a little bit more on vibes last year than anything else, but a lot of that was because I just had so little time that I had to pick what I wanted to read based on what I actually wanted to read. It turned out not working very well, because I had like 3 5-star books last year, and one of those was a 4.5 that I rounded up. Whereas this year, I have not read anything below 4 out of 5 so far, which is fantastic. And
That's pretty good.
3 new all-time favorites so far just this year, so I'm pretty successful. But
Do you mind if I ask what those are?
Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami, Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas, and Perfume by Patrick Zuskind. So again, 3 very different kinds of books. But nowadays, I think my schedule this year, I have tried the last couple years to have a rough schedule for the whole year. where the first quarter is more or less set in stone. The second quarter is a little bit looser. The third quarter is like, definitely things are probably not going to look this way by then. And then the last quarter is like, who knows if this is going to actually happen.
Sure.
So like varying degrees of how set it is, but I do plan things out a good bit ahead of time just so that I'm not floundering trying to figure out what I want to read. I don't like just kind of going solely off of mood. But a lot of times it's like friend recommendations or books that I'm excited to read with friends. This year, almost everything that I plan to read is outside of like the Wheel of Time thing, finishing that. A lot of what I'm reading this year is buddy reads to some degree with my friends in that private server that I referenced. So that's actually been a lot of it this year, because last year I didn't have time to read anything, let alone do buddy reads or anything. This year I'm getting back on like having things planned out and reading it with other people, kind of like what I was doing in 2022, to actually give a little bit more solidity, if that's a word, to my schedule. And I feel like that's actually helped a little bit this year in comparison to last.
You mentioned like Wheel of Time a couple times there. How long have you been reading it? What's your experience been with it? How are you feeling on the series coming up on the end here?
Loaded topic. No, I've been reading Wheel of Time for nearly 3 years at this point. I started Eye of the World May 2023, and I'll be finishing Memory of Light at the end of April 2026. So that'll be basically 3 years reading the series. So a long time. My experience with it, I have a lot of hot takes with Wheel of Time, as it turns out, because I love the first handful of books and actually notably think that The Shadow Rising is the weakest of the first 5 books, which is not a popular opinion. I had people trying to get on my case for hating The Shadow Rising. I rated it 4 out of 5, by the way. It was just my least favorite of the first 5 books, the only one that I didn't give 5 out of 5. What can you do? But anyway, so like I love the early series. By Lord of Chaos was when a little bit of prose bloat started to happen and when structural issues started to become a thing. Books 7 through 11 are both worse than people say and not as bad as people say, depending on who you're asking, because people make the slog out to be this absolutely horrific, like absolutely nobody should be reading this shit type of sequence. It's not that bad, especially if you know about it going into it. But it's also not the way that like mega fans of the series will try to be apologists and say that like, oh, it's not bad. Actually, I didn't even know there was a slog. And if that's your experience, fair enough. But I cannot take that seriously, because those 5 books without that much issue could have been 3. That's a trilogy arc split into 5 books.
Do the lamest treatment to it.
It would be much tougher than the lamest treatment, actually. But yeah, basically, in fact, to the degree that while I've been reading these last couple of books, the Gathering Storm, the Brandon Sanderson entries, reflecting on that previous arc, books 7 through 11, with a little bit of 6 in there, because there is a storyline that starts at the end of book 6 for some reason, which makes the last act of it feel like a first act again, which is where the structural issues start to become a problem. That was one of my major issues with Lord of Chaos, but there's like that little bit of thing. But then books 7 through 11, I have recently talked with a lot of friends about how, like, if I were to hypothetically re-edit the series, I know more or less exactly how I would take those 5 books and turn it into 3 without much issue. You take a particular plot line out of book 6 and book 8 and scrunch it all into 7, consolidate, cut a lot of prose bloat, because that's when prose bloat starts to become a problem. And then books 8 and 9 can be combined into 1 with some restructuring. And then books 10 and 11 can be combined into 1 with a lot of prose cutting. And you have a trilogy. That's the short answer to that. And I've also noticed, because books 12 and 13, those first couple Sanderson entries, also have some weird structural decisions made that were more or less forced to, because he wrote it as one book, but it's too long to be one book, so he had to make splits. I don't think that the splits that he made for the second book structurally actually make a lot of sense in and of itself, even though The Gathering Storm is great. So I would restructure those if I were to re-edit the series, as well as I would restructure Towers of Midnight a little bit. But overall, like, I do like the series a lot, but it's one of those things where I actually like individual books quite a bit, but
Sure.
looking at the series objectively as a whole, especially from a reviewer sort of critical standpoint, it's a loaded topic. When I quote unquote recommend the series to people, I say read the first 3 books because you have a really solid trilogy with them. And if you don't love the series or you don't have any inclination to read on beyond those 3, and especially if you struggle with even those first 3, don't read on, because the rest isn't going to change your mind. Because Wheel of Time big fans will be like, oh, but the Shadow Rising is when it really comes into its own. It's like, nobody cares when it comes into its own. If they don't like the first 2 books, they're
Right.
not going to like the series, because it is indicative enough of Robert Jordan's style where if they're struggling, nothing's going to change their mind. But if you like the first 3 books, read the next 3. And if you really struggle with the next 3, because I know plenty of people who, like me, love the first 3 but don't love the next 3 quite as much, if you don't like the next 3, give up. Like, don't even do the whole, read a summary unless you are dogged on finishing the series. I do know of one particular person who has recommended for people to skip books 6 through 11 entirely, and I think that is also very stupid.
I think that a series is probably has some pretty big flaws if we're saying here's entire like critical entries, not just like, oh, skip that one James Bond novel, that's not very good. Like, here's entries of the narrative that we're just gonna skip over.
Yeah, well, part of it is also kind of a thing. Like I said, the slog is not as bad as people say, but it's also not bad as people say. It's a case of whether you're going to be able to handle that is largely going to be on account of you. You need to know and trust what you feel like. And that's why I have to be so very specific about the way that I recommend the series. It's like, because it's complicated actually, and I think that there are some people who probably should actually like read summaries for books 10 and 11, for example. I have a friend who stalled on book 10, and I'm telling her, like, just read the fandom summaries of books 10 and 11. You'll be through that. You'll have everything you need to go into the Sanderson entries, and you will enjoy those again, I promise. And I know that would be the case for that person, but you have to tailor it basically on a person. For myself, I don't regret reading all of it. Actually, I don't. I enjoyed them well enough. Yeah. But I'm going to be honest and say that there are major issues, and I'm going to acknowledge those issues. But I'm also not going to tell people that this is absolute drudgery and that you should skip it or something, because it depends on the person.
What you described a minute ago, it was basically my experience, which is I read back when I first started getting into like proper, capital E epic fantasy. It was Wheel of Time, thanks Amazon and thank you Daniel Green. So it was,
of course, yeah,
Wheel of Time that I was getting into, and book 1 was like, it's a fun like Lord of the Rings, but it's basically a pastiche novel of Lord of the Rings, but it was entertaining enough. And then book 2 still has like some really fun fantasy things in it. Like I'm trying to remember, it's been years now, but like when certain characters like fall asleep next to standing stones and end up in another dimension, it's like, what, this is insane, what am I reading here? And
what's really annoying about the series is so many of those cool ideas that just get completely forgotten. Because honestly, Robert Jordan's biggest problem is that he was not an outliner.
Yeah,
he just discovery wrote. He had some big events that he knew he was going to, but he did not outline everything that was happening in between. And by the time you get to book 7 through 11, notably, this is why the slog is what it is. Also, you have to give him a little bit of grace. This was probably the period of time where he was discovering about his illness and stuff like that. So, of course, being respectful about that, but being an outliner would have allowed for some of these problems to not exist, because Wheel of Time's biggest problem is that it has really great scope, but it really fails to actually grasp all of it, because Robert Jordan very often forgets about pieces of it until all of a sudden it's just like, oh yeah, there's that thing. How am I going to use this? And so he'll either decide to just not use it or to change what it was. In some cases, he made retcons because people figured out what they were, which is annoying. And also cases where even major storylines he didn't know what to do with, so he just didn't do anything with them. Notably, Perrin's storyline does nothing for 3 books. It's literally he goes on a task that Rand sets him on in book 8, and then books 9 through 11 are dealing with that task, sort of like getting to doing that task, and then a side plot for 2 books. Why? Because I know exactly why. It's because Robert Jordan actually didn't know what to do with Perrin. He had no clue and didn't even have notes for Sanderson. Everything that Sanderson did with Perrin's character, he basically made up because he had like maybe a handful of sentences of notes for Perrin, and almost all of them were for after the series. So it's one of those things where Jordan, if you just planned some of these things out, all of the big problems with the series wouldn't exist. That's why I say books 7 through 11, you have a good trilogy in those 5 books. The reason they are 5 books is because because Jordan just kind of lost focus a lot and forgot a lot about what made the early series special. And some of them were those ideas, like from The Great Hunt. There are a lot of cool things in The Great Hunt, and even Eye of the World and Dragon Reborn, where it's like, there are some really cool stuff happening here. Half of that stuff never comes back.
Well, and then like Dragon
like
Reborn
the Waygates, for example. Waygates have been irrelevant for 7 books. And to be fair, like there's a very obvious reason why. It's because the characters don't actually need them, but like that's a cool thing that you should use. There are entire characters that are essentially forgotten. Loyal has not existed basically since like the first 5 books. It's like, why? I'm frustrated.
Right.
Yeah,
and book 3 was my favorite of what I read. Like, enjoyed. There's a criminal lack of Rand.
Based.
But I liked book 3. And then my experience is exactly what you described. I was getting these from the library, and I was so convinced because I've been on an upward trajectory, right? Like book 1, like book 2, liked more. Book 3 really liked. Book 4 is where they say Wheel of Time comes into its own. Surely I will love it. And I was like, half of this is just Dune remixed. And the rest of it is like my least favorite stuff that I've read so far. And I was expecting to love it. And I actually still bought a copy of it. So I still have like my audiobook of Shadow Rising. I'm like, oh yeah, didn't like you too much. And then by book 6, I was like, I haven't loved this series since Dragon Reborn. And that's where I jumped ship on the series.
Yeah, I think that's valid. For me, I love Fires of Heaven. That one is up there with Dragon Reborn amongst my favorites, actually. I think Gathering Storm, Dragon Reborn, and Fires of Heaven make my top 3 of the series at this point. And which one is actually my favorite kind of depends on technicalities. I could switch on a day. Most of it comes down to the things that make them weak. Gathering Storm, for example, is made weaker by Towers of Midnight's structural problems. Because, they were written as one book. And split. And so Gathering Storm by itself, incredible, but Towers of Midnight has some structural decisions that are like, I think some of this should have actually been in Gathering Storm so that this book could be better. And so Gathering Storm is slightly weaker because of that. In hindsight, which is unfair to it, I know. The circus plot line is infamous in Fires of Heaven, but I honestly actually really enjoyed it.
I didn't mind.
Say what?
I didn't mind it. I was like,
okay, good.
It fits in with the other silly stuff that pops
people
up
make such a big
while.
deal about that plot line, and I'm like, this bothered you, but like all of the Io Waste stuff and Shadow Rising didn't.
Right.
That takes way more of that book, and that was more miserable to me. But there's that, and then Dragon Reborn kind of has the weakness of introducing Zareen as a character. Fail, I call her Zareen out of spite, who is not a good character. And Zareen is actually the reason that I nearly DNF'd Shadow Rising, which is also funny because Perrin's storyline is the best part of Shadow Rising, despite her. So it's just, a lot of weird question marks. The series is it's so interesting, we shall say. I understand why it's as big as it is. I'm also one of those people who thinks that like the comparisons to Fellowship of the Ring with Eye of the World are overblown, for example. I'm one of those people. And I love Eye of the World. I think I arguably like it more than The Great Hunt, even though The Great Hunt is a better book.
Sure.
So it's like, I love the early series, books 1, 2, 3, and 5. Love those books. I also love New Spring. And then I love Gathering Storm, but the rest of the books have been solid or very messy. I also rather famously think that Winter's Heart is my least favorite. Not even Crossroads of Twilight or Path of Daggers. Those are usually the 2 least favorites. Winter's Heart is my least favorite. Okay. So I have a lot of interesting opinions about the series and probably wasting time with it.
Well, you've been reading it for 3 years. You said some of the books you're rather mixed on. So are you just like, when you pick up a book, is it like a stubborn dog on a bone, or do you ever drop a book and be like, nope, DNF it if you don't like it?
I am notably not a DNFer. There's a couple reasons for this. One of them is because I think that just about every book has something that you can get from it, something that you
Hmm.
can enjoy, or something that is, worth reading it for, generally speaking. Part of this is because I tend to pick books that I'm pretty sure I'm going to enjoy in the first place.
Right.
I don't just read books to read books. This is an argument that I've had with myself, and I'm considering making a video on this topic is, an average score should be theoretically right in the middle for stuff because that's what average means.
Right.
But in the case of media, as an individual person, your own personal average score of any type of media that you consume should not be right in the middle because you should be seeking for things that you're probably going to like. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go outside your comfort zone or try new things or explore around a little bit because you should do that. But there is a degree to which your palate should generally be being satiated by things that you think you're going to like for one
Yeah.
reason or another. And this is how I approach my reading. It's how I approach a lot of things, but my reading especially because I'm slow and I don't want to hate what I read. So I tend to pick things that I'm going to enjoy, which means that I tend to not DNF them because I don't hate them. Another reason why I don't tend to DNF books is because I do have a completionist mindset. Just kind of inherently, I do struggle with DNFing. I have DNF'd one book officially since I started doing booktube or reading. Like when I was in high school and I read a lot back then, there were a lot of books that I've DNF'd in my life unintentionally, books that like kind of put on pause and then never really picked up because of
Right.
burnout or whatever reason. But there's only one book that I've purposely DNF'd. And even that was more of a case where like I just was not jiving with the structure and have never felt the desire to go back when I put it on pause.
What was
Um,
that?
Tides of War by Stephen Pressfield. A
Interesting.
very surprising thing because it's a historical Greek mythological book
Hmm.
that's like by all means should be something that I enjoyed, but the framing device is overly complex for reasons that I didn't spend enough time with the book to understand. It is a
Okay.
character recounting a story of another person's recounting of another person's recounting of another person's story. That sounds exaggerated, but I'm not lying. It is literally one person telling another person's telling of another person's telling of another person's telling of Alcibiades' story.
That sounds like some
And
Cloud Atlas type of nonsense.
except that Cloud Atlas is kind of structured in a way where it seems like it makes sense from the offset because you can kind of see what it's doing just by looking at the chapters.
Right. Right.
And also, you kind of know going into Cloud Atlas that it's more literary, right? But yeah, Tides of War is one of those things where like that framing device just didn't work for me. I enjoyed chapter 5, but I read out of 9 chapters. Chapter 5 was the only one that I liked. The rest of them I just kind of struggled. I really struggled with that frame device. It was so unnecessary to have like the first 4 chapters just getting into all these devices. Maybe if I finished the book, I would understand why that decision was made, and maybe there's a good reason for it. But I was really struggling with it while reading it, put it on pause, and after 2 years, I finally determined it's just like I just am not I don't feel any reason to actually go back to it. I didn't feel like I was missing it for any reason. So I was like, I guess this is just my only DNF. I just don't think I'm ever going to finish it.
Hmm.
I haven't written off Pressfield entirely as a result of it. So by all means, I do think I'll enjoy Gates of Fire because it doesn't have the weird framing problem. But yeah, that's the one book I've DNF'd. So
Sure.
to answer that question, I don't really DNF books. I don't think it's much of a very dogged desire to be like, oh, I'm just going to finish this thing because I started it. Generally speaking, that's the case, but for the most part, it's because I'm genuinely really interested in what I'm reading, and even if I don't love it, there's still going to be some good reason to read it. That's part of why my takes on McCarthy are honestly my most unpopular
Hmm.
videos in general on my channel, are because I don't really like much of McCarthy's stuff. The books that I really like of his, I love. I love some of his books, but the rest of them I'm either just like, eh, or really don't like. Um, so I have some hot takes because of that. Notably, I hate Blood Meridian. That is a book that I almost wish I DNF'd,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I also want to try it again because I wonder if it's a me problem. I don't know because it's McCarthy, but
Yeah.
that's one of those like I have a 50% like ratio because 50% of people either agree with me or understand actually why I feel that way, or the other 50% are the lit bros who are just mad that I don't like Blood Meridian for some reason. But like The Passenger and Stella Maris, his last books, those are in my favorite books of all time. For example, No Country for Old Men, incredible. The Crossing, incredible. Even Outer Dark has some thematic issues where it's not really like agreeing with itself thematically. So like it has a holdback from that, but I otherwise like really like what part of what that book is trying to do thematically, even though the nihilistic worldview doesn't work for the themes.
Mm-hmm.
But so like what I enjoy from McCarthy, I really enjoy, but what I don't, I tend to really not like. So I don't like The Road and I don't like Blood Meridian. So those things
Those are
don't
the
make
two
me
like
very
popular
popular.
ones,
I am
right?
also not a huge fan of All the Pretty Horses, which is the first book of the Border trilogy, and that's the
Mm.
one that everybody loves from the Border trilogy.
Mm.
So yeah. But like I
That's
feel bad about it. I read The Road twice. I hated it the first time and I didn't hate it the second time, but I still didn't really like
mhm.
it. Blood Meridian, I notably really disliked. And to be fair, my initial review of Blood Meridian was a bad review. It was a bad review. That's why I did a follow up a year later where I reacted to my own review to explain, like, I still agree with my points. I just did not express this in any
Sure.
reasonable manner. And then stuff like the Border trilogy, where I don't love All the Pretty Horses. I love The Crossing, however. And then Cities of the Plain, I should have loved but didn't. So McCarthy's just a hot button. But anyway, what I was saying is that
Yeah.
McCarthy is one of those few authors where, like, I just read the entire bibliography because I wanted to read the entire bibliography and not necessarily because I was inherently interested in all the individual books.
Right.
I'm glad I did it. But it's kind of a case kind of like Michael Crichton and Stephen King, and there's another author or two somewhere that I have where like I just want to read all of the author's stuff
Mm-hmm.
just because. Um, Partially because they make for good palate cleansers, and partially because, because I have interest or history with those authors in some way that makes me want to. And that actually goes back to the original question of how I determine my TBR. A lot of my reading this year was based around things like Wheel of Time and my major book each month,
Mm-hmm.
and then having read along stuff. And a lot of that read along buddy read stuff being palate cleansers. I
Mm.
just have a lot of my TBR this year probably has the most variety of any of my years reading, just straight up on account of that, as far as authors and stuff go. I
That's
think.
interesting what you say about McCarthy there, because first, I don't know, was it Stella Maris and The Passenger are his two last books, and I know of a lot of like even McCarthy fans who didn't love those books. So
Yeah,
that's
it's really interesting. Those It's not that McCarthy fans don't like them, it's that they don't love them.
hmm,
And for some reason, I really connected with them. In fact,
hmm,
I have a video on my channel that's an hour long that was a scripted double review of those two books, where the review for The Passenger in particular exceeded Goodreads' character limit on reviews by like 5,000 characters. So I only included the spoiler-free portion in the Goodreads version, just like here's the video where I narrate my entire review. But yeah, it's interesting because I say in those videos as well, inflammatory stuff like, I don't think that Blood Meridian is his magnum opus. I think that the Western Family Duology is his magnum opus.
hmm,
I think the fact that he wrote those last is actually really beautiful thematically
hmm.
based on the way The Passenger goes. And part of it's also just kind of topical. There's some mental health related stuff that goes on with one of the characters in there that made like Stella Maris in particular just a very, very powerful book. And Stella Maris is also interesting because it's not even like a normal book. The Passenger is more like a normal book, but Stella Maris is dialogue.
Hmm.
There's not a word in that book that is not dialogue between two characters.
Yeah.
And that book in particular, Stella Maris on audio, really clicked, but because of the way that it interacts with the first book, thinking about those two as a pair, that's another one of those things where, like, when I did my favorite books of all time video, kind of like Iliad and Odyssey, when I did that cheating earlier, it's like I have to bunch these together. I can't
Yeah.
like separate these. I can't say I like The Passenger more than Stella Maris because neither one of them exists without the other. but yeah, McCarthy. It's interesting that those two books aren't super hype in the McCarthy fandom. The Passenger's a little bit more popular than Stella Maris, which makes sense, I guess. It's more of a normal book, and I do have friends who are surprised that I love The Passenger so much when I struggle so much with some of his other stuff. But yeah, it is really interesting with him. You get a lot of weird, different takes.
Well,
I am the one
with
that gives all the weird, different takes.
no, that's great, right? With Wheel of Time coming to an end, with Sun Eater obviously having just ended, and then you said this is like a vast array of books that you've got coming up on your TBR this year. What have you got coming up that you're really excited for? Do you have another like big commitment series that you're looking ahead at?
That's a good question. I technically have a big commitment series that I'm looking ahead at, but that's kind of like got an asterisk next to it. That's because I'm actually going to give Discworld a shot.
Okay.
I plan to read 6 Discworld books this year, so I'm going to be going like monthly, reading 6 of those books. But because a lot of Discworld is mostly standalone stuff in the first place, it's hard to really consider that in the same way. They're also pretty short. I'm doing those as buddy reads with a couple of people. I would say if there's any big commitment that I have coming up this year that I'm excited for, it's actually can you even see it you can in the very bottom corner there, the Legacy trilogy by Matthew Ward, those 3 colorful books.
Mm-hmm.
I've been meaning to read Matthew Ward for years. He's been like one of the authors that I'm most excited to try out just because I love those covers. They're simple, but I love them. And the concept of the series seems really dope. So I want to read those, and I plan to read those this summer. So
Okay.
that's a commitment that I have going on.
Interesting.
Otherwise, it's a lot of like Stephen King, Rick Riordan, Michael Crichton. I also am doing my Tolkien reread stuff this year. Like I'm going to be rereading The Hobbit with a friend in May. I'll be rereading Lord of the Rings in October. Stuff like this.
That's a good time of year to reread Lord of the Rings.
Well, I mean, October 2021 was when I reread The Hobbit when I got back into reading, and then I did Lord of the Rings over November, December, January. So October was the month that I had available, and the same friend that I'm going to be rereading The Hobbit with, he hasn't read Lord of the Rings yet. And so I was like, well, I want to reread it soon. So what if we just do that together? And he wants to do it all as one, which makes sense because all of Wheel of Time combined is not much longer than a Wheel of Time or Sanderson book at this point. So we're going to do that in October, and it'll be great.
Well, I just because I've been seeing it the whole video, I'll just plug this. Chance Dillon's book behind you, Mercy, Tears of the Fallen, book 2 coming out soon here. I don't know if that's on your TBR soon, but I think you'll like that one.
I'm pretty sure I'll like it. I was actually thinking for a little bit that I would get to Mercy early this year. But then things changed with my TBR where I didn't, because I was going to try to read the first book before the second one came out so I could read it basically at release. Like I said, it didn't really fall into place to work out that way, but that one's one I'm excited for, especially since it's dark fantasy. And, going back to that Oathbringer Penance of Blood that we mentioned earlier, if anybody watching this wants dark fantasy, and especially if you want any kind of high fantasy that isn't 1.5 million words long, Oathbreaker's solid, because that first book, only 300 pages. The second book, only 300 pages or so. So, like, they're really good dark fantasy settings, but they're also really limited in their scope and how much stuff they're doing. You can feel the size of the world. There's a lot of stuff that gets, like, kind of brought up, but not info dumped to you. The narrator is just like, you don't need to know about this thing, so I'm not going to explain it. But there's other things where it's like, you do need to know about this thing, so I'll explain this, So it's good about picking and choosing that kind of stuff, but it's short and it's good dark fantasy. But yeah, Mercy I do want to read because of the dark fantasy thing. Although I hear it's got a lot going on. So
that is true. There's a lot to that one.
So yeah, maybe sometime else. Like I was thinking if I would try to do that this year, but I've been putting off Matthew Ward for 3 to 3.5 years at this point. So I'm going to read that this year. And I also want to try to get him on the channel. Interestingly enough, that author, Matthew Ward, if you've played any of the more recent Warhammer games, if you've played Vermintide 2 or Darktide, he was the main writer on those video games.
No kidding.
So
okay.
That's the same guy. So I'm going to try to read those and see if I can inquire to get him on the channel. That would be an interesting thing to try to do.
Yeah, very nice. Well, Casey, I think we'll probably land the plane there. But thank you for chatting with me for a little bit this evening, and I'll make sure to do all the well, I'll let you do the plugs, but I'll just say your channel will be linked down below. Besides your main booktube channel, what else would you like to plug here?
I'll just kind of limit it to my second channel. If you want to search that up, it's at King Cruso VODs, or if you just search up King Cruso the second, like King Cruso II, the way that kings do that whole shtick. The second channel is where I do non-book related media stuff. So it's where I cover film and video games and music. So I do all that on the second channel, books on the main channel. And then the only other thing is King Cruso the third is the tag for that is King Cruso IRL. I have one video over there that was a short story that I wrote at the time of recording about a month ago that kind of happened accidentally, and it's maybe my favorite thing I've done. So check out that. I did a narration of that story over on that channel. So that's the main thing I'll plug, I guess.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah.
I'm bad at social media, so I'm not going to bother with that.
No, that's okay. Everyone go check out Casey's channels there. Like I said, a booktuber that I've really enjoyed getting to see his stuff, and then also getting to talk with him this evening. So yeah, well, we'll end it there. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me too.